Okay, good evening. Tonight's going to be a little bit different. We're going to spend um, a lot of time on one specific source. I wasn't able to send it because Safaria didn't have it, so you'll have to listen along. The topic is the last Mishnah in Kiddushin. We finished Kiddushin a few days ago. Mazel tov to all those who finished it. And I want to read a piece from the Mishnah, and it may ring a bell. If anybody out there remembers, we had a shiur similar to this one about, I'd say, February 2022, which was about 20 months ago. Shmuel, remember?
Oh, yeah, very well.
Okay. The last Mishnah on Daf Pei Beis in Kiddushin is talking about the various professions that the Tanaim recommend you should do, what you shouldn't do. So the very last Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer on Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo yeh ravak. I'm sorry. Kol she'isko im hanashim lo yisyachet im hanashim. And it talks about whether you should have a profession where you deal mainly with women. It's not recommended. V'lo yomad adam es beno umnos ben hanashim. Okay, Rab Meir Omer. So this is where I want to start from. Rab Meir Omer la'olam yilamed adam es beno umnos nikia v'kala. Okay, if you could choose what profession you want your children to go into, you should pick something that is nikia v'kala. Okay, a nice, easy-going profession. Okay, I don't know what that means today, because nothing is nice, nothing is easy. The yispalel l'misha ha'osher v'hanachasim shalo, and okay, if you want to be successful, you should pray. Okay, that's a key component, says Rab Meir. You should pray to the one who has the wealth, right, which is God. She'ein umnos she'ein bo aniyos v'ashiros. Okay, shelo aniyos bin umnos v'ashiros bin umnos. Every trade, no matter what trade you go into, you'll have good times. They're all cyclical. You'll have good days. You'll have bad days, says the Mishnah. And and the truth is, if you really follow the scorecard in heaven, one day they'll tell you that your ability to make money is not necessarily tied to your particular degree that you earned in college, okay, or your level of partner you are at work, or whatever degree or kind of doctor you are. That's really not, that may seem like that's where your money comes from, but the Mishnah says that's not where it really comes from. Ela hakol lefi zechuto. Rab Meir says it's all according to your zechus. Okay, that's what Rab Meir says. Rab Shimon ben Elazar Omer ra'ita mi'amecha chaya v'of sheyesh lehen umnos. Rab Shimon ben Elazar says, have you ever seen a bird or an animal working at a convenience store? No. They have misparnas in shalobitzar, and what at the end of the day, they get their parnasa. They don't have to punch in. They don't have to work 9 to 5. They're hungry. They hunt. They get food. Okay. And those animals were created to serve me. And I was created to serve my Lord. So he makes the kal v'chomer and says, if the animal, which doesn't have to work, but nevertheless is subservient to me, I, who, right, rule over the animal, certainly I should have the advantages that an animal has. Okay? So that's what Rav Shimon ben Elazar says. But the bottom line is, V'anini v'reisi l'shamish eskoni, so ela shehereti ma'asai v'kipachti es parnasi, but I blew it. Okay? I sinned, and I'm not worthy. So therefore, we all have to go to work and make a living. Okay. I want to focus in, and we had this sugya before, I want to talk about this concept of Ella Hakola Fi Zechuto. Okay, so Rashi doesn't say anything. If you look at the very last Tosfos in the Masechta, the word Zechuto, okay, when we define Zechut, what does it mean? What does Rav Meir mean when he says that you could do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, right, it's not your degree, it's not how many years you put into the business, it's all your zechus that makes you the money. So Tosfos says, the very last Tosfos, Perish Lafi Mazla. Okay, Tosfos quotes the Gemara that we had in Moed Katan that we had a shir on together, which said, I believe the person who said this is Abaya, Debani v'chayu mezone, lo b'zchus Talia milsa, ela b'mazla Talia milsa. Okay, when it comes to, forget children for a second, when it comes to Parnasa, which is what the subject of this mission is talking about, right? When it comes to Parnasa, Tosfos says the word zechus is a translation of the word mazel. Okay, you have it or you don't have it, right? You could be sick, you could try all you want, you could be spend a number of years learning something, learning a profession. Sometimes it clicks, sometimes it doesn't click. It's all, says Tosfos, according to your mazel. Okay, I want to focus on the Tiferes Yisrael because we quoted this last time we learned this, but we just said it in passing. I want to spend some time reading because this happens to be the magnum opus of the Yachin and Boaz. The Yachin and Boaz is written by the Tiferes Yisrael. Now, unfortunately, it's actually not available, or at least the Boaz isn't. Basically, the Tiferes Yisrael Lifshitz, he lived at the end of the 1700s, I believe in Warsaw, Krakow, somewhere in Poland. I know he's buried there. And he wrote a parish on the Mishnayos called Yachin and Boaz. Yachin is like the Cliff Notes, and Boaz goes into the longer version of the parish called Yachin. And I call it a magnum opus because I think it's the longest he ever wrote on one specific Mishnah. And the reason why it's famous, as we're going to see, is because he delves into the mysterious topic of what the Mishnah means when it talks about the word mazel. Okay? So what I'd like to do is, first of all, the way he starts off is by asking a very simple question. He asks the question that the Tosfos Yontiv asks. The Tosfos Yontiv says, I don't understand something. The Mishnah just says, if you interpret like the word Tosfos uses the word mazel, right? Again, the Mishnah doesn't use the word mazel, it uses the word zechus. So the Tosfos Yontiv asks a famous question. He says, he says, if this is all predetermined and we're all, based living on what our fate dictates, then why should I spend time davening? Okay, he has a very, very existential question, right? So he kind of gives an answer where it's like a blend, where you need one, right? Various ingredients. You need a little bit of mazel, right? You need a little bit of chachma. You need a little bit of talent. So that's really where the Tosfos Yontif goes. But I want to read exactly how the Tiferes Yisrael tries to answer it by himself. Okay, I'm going to read. Unfortunately, I can't send the source, but it's just, it happens to actually be very easy Hebrew. I highly, highly recommend, everyone, if they're capable, although unfortunately, I do not believe there's an English translation, but just listen along and enjoy. It says, so the Tiferes Yisrael says, I want to give an answer for the problem that the Tosfos Yontif brought up. Okay? The Rabboseinu Balei Tosfos Hichrichu Dizachusta Nakadhacha Eino Milashon Zach V'Naki B'Tzid Kosav. He says, I'll answer this question. He says, according to my understanding, the word zechus, okay, which usually is interpreted as a merit, does not come from the same root that we're used to thinking about. Okay, it's not a zechus, it's not a merit. Okay, he says the zechus de kama Rav Meir hainu lashon kinyan. He says it's not that it's all up to zechus. He says you could work hard, you could work 40 years and try and go back to law school and then go to this school and that school and that school and try all you want and spend a lot of money, right? But at the end of the day, it's your zechus. So what is a zechus? It's not like Tosas says it's all mazel. Either you were predestined to do it or not. He says that the word zechus is actually lashon kinyan. Okay, meaning, like, for example, the word zochin la'ada, right? Or the word, right? What does zachin la'ada mean? Right? We had this sugya. Zachin la'ada means you could acquire something for someone else. You could appoint someone, or someone can acquire something for you without your knowledge, assuming that it's something that's beneficial to you. So the word zachin actually is a word similar to the word kinyan. Okay, something that you acquire. Okay, and he says hachinami lashon kinyan hu v'ratzalom ramasha kana al yidei hamazel. So he says it's a combination. It's something that you acquire through mazel. And he says, Ulafizeh kavanat hamishna lefi perish Tosfos. So now the Boaz explains what Tosfos meant, shegam umnis nakia v'kala. He says, if you want the recipe for success, okay, so it's that profession that's nakia v'kala, an easygoing, light profession, v'gam tefillah, along with tefillah, shnehen lo yo'ilu rak lefi midas hamazel. He says, even if you have those two components are only acquired, okay, with a combination of mazel. Okay, so that's the way he explains the interpretation of Tosfos, what Tosfos means by the word mazel. Okay, so that's one piece I want to at least explain. The second piece I want to explain is that he goes into a long, long essay. He says the following: Amnam gam hashkach koach haguf v'ha'osher u'shleimas hanefesh tolushu v'dalet sibos minusos. He says there are really 4 components that affect our being. Okay, he gets very deep over here. Like, for example, today psychologists are always studying what is it that makes us tick, right? Nature, nurture, is it a combination? What is inside of us that dictates to us how we're going to grow up? What are we going to be? What kind of person we're going to be? So, I mean, keep in mind, this was written about a little over 200 years ago, okay, in Poland. So he says there are basically 4 components. He says, B'teva, haklali hamushlam ba'olam, hamushalat ba'olam. First is teva, okay, what we would call nature. Second is behishtadlut ha'adam. It's hishtadlus, right? How much effort, right? As we say, no pain, no gain. How much effort is a person willing to put in, right? What you put in is a recipient, right? Is what you take out. So that's the second point. The third is bitzidkas orishas shalada va'atzmo, the inherent nature of a person. There are people who are very, very righteous, and there are people who are rishaim, who are downright evil. Okay, so that is the third component that affects us. Okay, and the fourth one is mazel. Okay, what is mazel? He says, mazel is what accompanies us that we can't get rid of from the day we're born until the day we die. Then he says as follows: Ulam im kikol daled elu hem sibot lahatzlachto ulebilti hatzlachto shel adam ba'olam ha'over. He says these four components are alone the reason for someone's hatzlacha, someone's success, or someone's failure. Afal pikein ein kolach kulan shaveh b'ha'inyan. He says, but the truth is, these three are not treated equally. The koach hateva, when it comes to nature, for example, yachol adam larov lekavsha b'koach hagufa haschel. He could be naturally born a certain way, very smart, very strong, very strong-minded. He could be very successful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he'll always be successful. Yeah, that's only one component. And he goes through each and every single component. And I don't want to read it. It's really going to take a long. I'll just summarize some of the key points. But he basically says that these four are kind of working in like a, what do we call, like a yin-yang, right, situation, where they're always, right, they're always in flux. And he says, for example, after he basically describes that you could have any of these four attributes, sometimes working for you, sometimes working against you, he says, I'm skipping, Ulefiha amur, kol ela hasibot, dahainu hateva. Again, the teva, hishtadlut, Tzadik v'rasha, kulan einon sibot machikot l'tova, orat ha'adam. Those three necessarily, aren't what seal the deal. Ulam hem rak sibot efshariot. Those are what we call efshariot. They have input, but they're not 100%. Aval. So what is the decider? Aval rak hamazol hu siba muchrechet maimed ha'adam l'tov u'l'ra. He says the mazel is the bottom line, whether or not this person is going to succeed. And he brings down a famous story that I want to learn inside with you because it really illustrates this concept that we don't really think about because, we just blame ourselves a lot of the time or compliment ourselves that, oh, this is something that I screwed up, right? Something I did wrong. Or I made a lot of money. I was successful because I did this. I was in the right place, right? I was this. I have this, characteristic. People like me, so they gave me an opportunity, right? We like to pin everything on ourselves. But here's a story that may make us think twice. This is a story from Tainus Daf Chafei Amud Aleph. Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedas dechika le milsa tuva. Okay, the Gemara in Tainus. If you remember, Chav Gimel, Chav Daled, Chav Hey, there's very, very many stories. And specifically on Daf Chav Hey, we talk a lot about unfortunate stories of people who are very, very righteous, but unfortunately very, very poor. Okay, so one of them was Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedas. Okay, he was very poor. Avid milsa, v'lo havele midi limitam. One day, he had to do an act of bloodletting. Okay, and the Gemara discusses many times that you have to eat the day you do bloodletting. It's not good for you. It's not healthy. So, but he didn't have money. He couldn't afford to buy food. So shkal bra de tuma v'shadya b'pume. So what he did was he took some garlic and he put it in his mouth. That's all he could afford. Chalash li bevenim. So he fainted and he fell asleep. Azal Rabbanan l'shuleve. So the Rabbanan came by and saw him that he was fainting. Okay, so after he awoke, chaziu de kabachia v'chayach. They saw he was crying and then he was laughing. Unafak tzutzisa denura meapuse, and a ray of light came shining out of his forehead. Okay, so what's the explanation? Ki itar. So when he was fully awake, Amile, they said to him, My time of kabachas v'chayichet. Why were you on the one hand laughing, right? This reminds you of the story at the end of Makos, right? Of Rabbi Akiva, where he was laughing, everyone else was crying, right? So they wanted to know, why were you laughing and why were you crying? The Amrila and Rabbi Lezer and Pedas replied as following. He says, Admata Yitztar Bahayalma. What happened was, he said that he had a dream. I'm sorry, to have a Yasavi Mekadosh Baruch Hu. I was in a dream and God was next to me. The Amrilay, okay, and I said to God, Admata Yitztar Bahayalma. He says, how much am I going to suffer poverty living in this world? The Amrli, and he said, Elazar b'ni, nichalach lapuchle alma maresha. He said, I wanted to console him. He said, would it be better for you if I started over from the beginning? If I started over the world from the beginning? Okay. Efshar demiladet b'shata demizone. Maybe you would be born under a better sign and not be poor. Very interesting. Amri Kamai. So Rabbi Lezer ben Pedas said to God, Kulei Hai, the Efshar? Right? Think of the answer he gave. He didn't say sure. He said, God, you suggest this takana to basically turn the world upside down and start over from the beginning, the Efshar, and you're only telling me that it's a possibility that things could be different, but not a certainty? Right? That's the answer that Rabbi Lezer ben Pedas gave to God. The Amar Li, but Amar Li, the Chayas. So I said, so he further said to God, he said, the years that I have right now, right? The Chayetfe o the Chayina. Am I past the midpoint in my life? Meaning, do I have more years left to live than I am now, or am I less, or do I have less years to live than I lived up to now? So Amrali the Chayes. So God answered him and said, the years that you lived so far are greater than the years that you're going to live from here on in. Amri L'kamei. So I said before God, Im ken lo be'ina. If he said, basically he's saying, I don't have a lot left to live, so therefore don't go back and blow up this world and create a new one just for the sake of me living a few more years. Okay, so that's what the story said. Okay, that's the Gemara he quotes. So on that, the Tiferes Yisrael says, Yesh od kama miniyot l'tashlum me'schar v'onesh b'olam hazeh l'tzadik ol l'rasha mikoach hamazal. Right, and he quotes this story, and he says, Bo re'eh kama koach kasha koach hamazal. He says, if you look at the story now, again, we just interpreted the story the way it's written, and it's very hard to understand, but at least let's try to understand it on its most basic element. And he says, look at how difficult this koach hamazal is. The Hare Rebbe Lezer ben Pedas mibnei palton shel melachaya. He was so high, right, in the spheres. And God still couldn't change his teva. He couldn't change anything. He said, yes, maybe I could rewind the world, start over, and you have a puncher's chance, okay, of starting fresh to be born under a different sign. But that's all he could offer him. So that's to a tzaddik like Rabbi Lezer ben Pedas. Anan yasme di yasme manana. Abasrei us, says the Tiferes Yisrael, who are paupers compared to Rabbi Lezer ben Pedas, what could we possibly say? So we see a powerful message from this story of how powerful this koach of mazel is. So that's the that's the next component that he deals with. Now, in continuing on, he actually explains what the word mazel comes from. Okay, v'nevaer milas mazel mahu shorasho nazal. He says the shoresh of mazel is from the word nun zayin lamed, What does that mean? Ratzolomer kidavar hanozel v'hanigara. The word in Hebrew today, nizila, is a leak. Okay, you have a leak. It's called a nizila, but it's something. It's like a stream. It's like a drop of water that keeps on accumulating. He says, "Shehu mechubar yachad ketipot meinachal hamubrim b'mored." Right? It's like a stream. The water in a stream is collected from various different sources. Sheyavau b'shetef chazak behechrech lahamek. Right? It all comes together. Ayidei hit achdut hatipuach behamayan o hamayanot shehem lomala. But the hisachdus of all the water droplets can come spread out from many, many, many different sources. Okay? Kach makriyat ha'adam lahara ulahitev. That is exactly comparable to man, for good or for bad, meaning the situations and the circumstances that a person finds himself in. And this is a really, really deep point. It's something that we just take for granted. And we're like, sure, but here's his point. He says, everything we do is a accumulation of various sibot, reasons that are all connected. Meaning we are here today, I'm here today because my great, 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 great grandfather found someone and he had a son and he had a son, and you go all these years, right? And everything had to work out, and out comes me, or out comes you, right? We're all a product of a long line, which could have changed depending on many, many different situations. Shekshurin v'achuzin zeba zekenachal. Vehem yachinu ba'ofen muchrach ma'amadu bein tov o l'ra. Now, the result can be great, or the result could be disastrous. B'mamon u'b'midat hanefesh. All of the accumulations, and as the word they're using math, I think, is permutations, right? All the possibilities, right? All the possibilities result in one thing. Like, for example, you set directions and you go somewhere, and 4 hours later you're there. And when you look back, right, the old days, remember we had to print the instructions from MapQuest, right, before Waze. So you would hit print and you'd have 16 pages, and it would tell you, make a left here, go a mile, make a right, make a left, go straight, make a right. And when you do all 47 different commands, that'll take you 3 hours later to your destination. But 47 things have to go right in order for you to reach your destination. If you make a wrong turn in any of those possibilities, you won't get to where you're going. You'll end up somewhere, you'll end up in a place, but you're not going to end up in the place where you're going to. And that's the beautiful point that he compares. Our existence today is basically a result of years and decades and centuries of someone pulling the strings. And it's really a deep point. You think about it, like for example, you sit down next to someone, right? You're at a football game. There's 60,000 people, and throughout the game, right, you make a friend who's sitting next to you, and you say, "Wow, what are the chances that I would be sitting next to you?" And of all these people, right, how is it? So you came from here, I came from there, we came from 100 miles away, and fate brought us together to sit down right next to each other. Now, the answer, not the answer, but the argument to this is that, yeah, you have to sit next to somebody, right? So the other part of this discussion is that eventually we're going to find someone who to sit next to. It's like the lottery winner, right? Someone has to win eventually. The odds are 1 in 292 million, but every single day somebody wins the lottery. Okay? And everyone says it's not going to be me, but it has to be someone. So that's a different discussion. But what he's trying to say is that for you your mazel, your makeup is years and years and decades and century of pre-planning to figure out why this person, why I'm here at this, right, at this certain time. It's like the famous line, I think it was Mark Twain, who said, right, the two most important days of your life is the day that you're born and the day you figure out why, right? Because we have a purpose here, and all of these years of preparation were to put you in a certain spot. So that's the next chunk that we just explained. The next part I want to read is where he talks about the contributing factors to mazel. He says there's something called yesh mazal galoi v'yesh mazal ne'elam. Okay, let's talk about the two different types. There's mazel that's galoi, okay, that's revealed, and then there's hidden mazel. He says mazal haguloi hu shisha minim vehen tzibot machrichot. He says the mazel that comprises everyone are basically 6 characteristics or contributing factors that shape a person, right? The way, which psychologist was it? Maslow, who says you have these orders, right, in life. I forgot who it was, but right, there's a certain, right? So he says there are certain reasons that shape the way they are. He says, first of all, it's your parents, right? Ayidei Aba'im, meaning they contribute your DNA. So you will be predisposed, you'll have a tendency to be like your parents. Now, you can't escape that, right? So that's obviously 1/6 of your makeup. The second is, Sibabet Ayidei Machuz Haaretz Aklis. He says the climate where you're born. Very interesting what he says over here, right? He says that has an effect on your body, right? Are you going to be strong or weak? Are you going to be handsome or not handsome? Bahanira, he says, the people living in there's no northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, but let's just call it the north part of the world have a better chance than people living in the southern parts of the world. I assume he's referring to Africa, right? I assume he's comparing, Europe, let's say, to Africa. The Anshe Darim Yoter Gavohim Bakoma, but the advantage that the people in the south have is that they're taller. The Chazakim and stronger Ma'anshe Tzafon, right? Uberosham, okay, and he's basically saying that there's nothing you could do about it. You could fight all you want to be taller, but where you're born, who your parents are, right? Where you come from, these are all factors as to who you're going to be. The third thing is Hazman, the time you're born. What do you mean the time? He says, are you going to be born? He says, right, what kind of person you're going to be, depending on what season you're born. Or he says, what kind of economy, right, is going on in the world? Are you being born, right? Are you born in the era of a depression? Obviously, you're going to be different than if you're born in the era of, good vibes, as they say. So how exactly are you raised? What are you eating, right? What's your diet like? Now, again, that's a function of your socioeconomic, where you come from, right? The fifth one is Hagidol, right? The way you're raised, right? How you were brought up. And the sixth one is Hamalacha v'ha'esek o hapkuda, right? What is your job? Which of course goes back to our discussion, right? Are you a schlepper, right? Are you gonna have a bad back because you're hunched over all day schlepping boxes? Okay, what do you do all day? So all of these are contributing factors. He says, Eile, he says, well, what's very important is that these 6 factors are always, as they say today, in tension, meaning there's always an imbalance. And he says, Eluhen shisha hasibur hagluyot hamachrichot asher alpihen yistovev maimed ha'adam begufa ubemamona ubenefesh lahara ulahetiv. For good or for bad, these are always going to be revolving in you. Lefi riboy hasibot elo lefi hachlaftan zumuzu. They're always going to change around. Lefamim yelachmu hasibot ela neged ela. You're going to have an internal war. Yuchra hadavar echad rabim lahatos. Right? V'zehanikra mazal galui. This is your mazal galui. Okay, this is your makeup. And like I said, there's always going to be competition and tension between these six, so to speak, contributing factors. He says, Udenefesh ha'adam acher im sibot hafuchot me'ela. Then you're going to have someone who's completely different, who's born in a different place, in a different time, to a different family, right? So why is that fair? We don't know the answer, he says. Only God knows why. And he quotes the Gemara Nida that says Shakadosh Baruch Hu gozer ala tipa mayehe aleha gibor chalash chacham otipesh ashir ani. Right? The Gemara Nida says that God predestines all of this. Where you're going to be born, when you're going to be born. Are you going to be born into a smart family? Are you going to be born into? Are you going to be strong? Right? Are you going to be born into a wealthy family? Nikra Bestimmung. In German, the word for destiny is, or what you're going to be in life is called Bestimmung. That's the German word. Shehuchot al ha'adam kodem yitzira. So that's predetermined before you're created. Okay. So now that we said all this, okay, ukamo she'en lishol habore lama bara lazeh kohen ulazeh levi ulazeh ish ulazeh isha. Now that we know all this, that it's basically not really in our hands, so therefore you can't say, hey, why was I born a kohen? Why was I born a Levi? It's not fair. Why was I born into this family? Why wasn't I born into the other family? Why was I born a female? Okay, why was I born a male? Why was I born Jewish? Why was I born not Jewish? Or lazeh pil va'ari chazak, lazeh zvuv v'tolat chalish dal. Why is an elephant born an elephant and a fly born a fly? Kokach lo nuchal lishol oto lama barazeh im sibot lutovaso v'zeh im sibot laroso. You can't ask that question. Belti safek hakol betfuna v'dat k'dei sheyasig hashlomoto zeh ba'ofen zeh v'zeh ba'ofen zeh. Asher belti safek kach muchuyav u'muchrach hayashi yeh nivrakach rak shalafi kach. Right, basically, lo nasig hatam. These are answers we will never ever know. You live a million years, you'll never know the answer. V'hu hanikra mazal hane'elam. This is what he called a few minutes ago the mazal hane'elam. Again, it doesn't show itself where you're born, who your parents are, the climate you're born, the socioeconomic time what you're born. That is up. That is revealed. What's not revealed is this. Is all these questions that we have, which is called mazal ne'elam. Why you come out the way you come out. Amnam yesha sheratzu lahachnis bein mazal hagolu l'mazal hanelam shazacharnu. He says there are those people who want to talk about this. And he says, "O davar echad memutza." So here's what I'll tell you: the reason why you're born a certain way. V'ratzu lahashiv el shalatenu lama nivra adam zeh im sibot eleh v'acharim havchan. So there are people that like to talk about this. V'yashivu oto davar shel korchach yekach mipnei she'adam zeh nolad b'shat shashabtai o ma'adim o tzurat kochavit achar ola. He says, and this is the Gemara we quoted last time at the end of Shabbos that talks about, well, if you're born during the constellation of Ma'adim, which is Mars, you have a disposition toward red, which is blood, and as we discussed then, you could channel it to, you could be a shochet, you could be a mohel, but unfortunately, you could also be an axe murderer. So that is up to you. What your tendency is depending on what day of the month you're born and what mazel, which we define as constellation, was in the sky. So let's see what he says about constellations. So he says, I don't believe in it. If you believe that, Ech sheishlichu lanu karnei oran. He says, Ratzu ba'alei zu litlos bebli stabot ele v'kol ze hevel ta'atuim ein bo mamish klal. He said, this is all hogwash. Do not listen to the Gemara that talks about it. Rak karkir chalomos shetef hahamon. It's the crow crying out. This is all what we call bull. Shechafatzim tamid bedavar she'ein hasechel tov. So we don't understand it. He says, if you believe in the astrology that you read and say, I'm not going to do this because the astrologer told me that I'm a Gemini and this is a good week for a Gemini and I don't have to do X or I have to do Y. He says this goes under the category of lo te'onenu, right? Which is a lav that the Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about, that you cannot follow the astrologers. And he goes on and on and on. And I just want to read until the end, the conclusion, where he says that Ulam hachrazot medudahi amininiat verbuim kamosha evenu el mitshuva shishiv kodesh baruch. He says, go back to the Gemara in Tainus. Ki kol sibot ha'ela shezacharnu hen ba'amitot kochod hateva ba'hateva hu matbeya shel melech makodesh baruch hu. It's what God stamps us. He says, and it's very, very difficult once a king stamps something to reject it and to go and play rewind. That's not going to happen. He ends off, he says, what does help? You can't go back and beg for a better destiny. What you could do is you could pray. Okay, lasot lifamim. Okay, Ma'achamim poshrin. You could make, as we say, lemonade out of lemons. Ukumasha kashuv chazal, that palal gambada haron. He says, v'hakol if rov ha'maisel, if rov ha'miniyot. Okay, a very beautiful, I didn't do it justice because I skipped around, but I just wanted to let everyone know that if they ever want to look at this more deeply, this is where to find it. So my message tonight, because we actually start a new Seder, but I thought after seeing that Mishnah and then doing the first Mishnah in Bava Kama, I said, wow, look at that. I see some kind of connection between this whole discussion of Mazel and Zechus and things that are in our control, things that are not our control. So I turned to the Mishnah Arba Avos Nezikin, and it talks about a shore. Okay, so we have psukim that are quoted on Daf Beis Amud Beis, where the fun starts. The fun starts in Parshas Mishpatim. Okay, the shore has different attributes to it. We have the keren, we have the shein, as we're learning in the last 4 days, and we have the regel. Okay, so the psukim in Mishpatim that introduce this concept, it says v'chiyigach shor es ish o es isha v'ames sakol yisakel hashor v'lo yachol espazor ba'al hashor naki. The very first time we have an introduction to an animal, in this case an ox, doing damage is if it gores a man or a woman. So the rule is, doesn't matter, we kill the shor, but the owner is not to be punished. Okay, that's one pasuk. And the other pasuk that talks about a shor not killing a man, but doing damage to a different shor, says v'chiyigaf shor is a shor ehu v'ames, which is called keren. Okay, so the Gemara learns from two psukim, one of kiyigof and one in kiyigach. So the Gemara has a question. I am on Daf Beis Amud Beis, about 3/5 of the way down. The Gemara says, we establish that the first pasuk of Kiyigach shor, okay, is talking about a shor doing damage, right, with his keren to a man, right? And the second pasuk of Kiyigof is when a shor does damage to another shor. Why does the Torah, ask the Gemara, use the word Kiyigach for a person But when a shore is doing damage to its fellow shore, it uses the word ki yigof. Good question. So the Gemara answers, Adam de isle mazla ksiv ki yigaf. Man, we're comparing man versus animal. A man has mazel, okay, as we just talked about for 45 minutes. Okay, therefore it says ki yigach. Umayshnaga behema. You know why behema it says ki yigof? Because behema the lesle mazla ksiv ki yigof. What does that mean? A man has mazel, so therefore, when the Torah describes an animal killing a man, it says ki yigach if the shore gores. But the word yigof, which is just a delicate push and does damage to an animal, it only uses the word ki yigof. So what does that mean that a person has mazel? So Rashi explains that, I'm reading Rashi, Niskaven hashor lahara, uva alav bekoach. Okay, well, there's actually two interpretations of Rashi. Let's use the second interpretation. Isle mazla, ve'eno noach lahamiso ben negifa. Okay, when a person has mazel, let's just translate it as simple luck, meaning a person has a better outcome, has a statistically better chance to survive a goring, okay? Forget what you see in, Pamplona, Spain, but a man has a better chance of surviving a goring than a animal does because a man has mazel and doesn't die as quickly, as opposed to a negifa where an animal has a better chance of pushing the other animal and causing damage and killing it. Okay, that's the way Rashi at least explains the Gemara. Okay, the Rabbeinu Bechaya explains it a little bit differently. In his parish on Mishpatim, he says as follows: Hiski ba'adam lashon negicha. When it comes to when a shore gores, it uses the word negicha. Aval bebehema b'shor shehim is shor hiskir negifa, and he quotes the Gemara in Bava Kama, and he says klomar she'asa b'miskaven ubehashgacha pratis. But behema delesle mazle hisker ben negifa klomar b'derech mikra. So he explains that different than Rashi. Rabbeinu Bechai explains that because the fate of a person is influenced by what we call hashgacha pratis, meaning we have a mashgiach watching over us. So the question you may ask is, do animals have hashgacha pratis? Right? We know God is watching us. Is God watching all the stray dogs and cats and the hamsters and the rats, right, in New York City? So that's a very interesting question. And believe it or not, the Sefer HaChinuch, we're not going to talk about it now, but there is a discussion about this. And at least in the opinion of the Sefer HaChinuch, animals do not have hashgacha pratis. They have what's called hashgacha klalis, which is there's a general safeguard on animals, but not individually. What we call hashgacha pratis is individual supervision. Okay, humans are on a higher level, so therefore we're influenced by this hashgacha pratis, okay, that's acting on our fate. So therefore the Torah uses the word ki yigach, because the word yigach indicates intent, meaning animals just don't gore instinctually. It takes a few seconds, it takes a minute for them to look and to think and to premeditate this kind of serious goring, right? But when animals fight each other, he says, because they don't have hashgacha pratis, right? They're not subject to these influences, right? These heavenly influences. So therefore, the Torah describes what happened. He says, "Hiskir b'negifa klomar b'derech mikra." It's just a mere unintentional push. Okay, so he's very similar. He's very similar to what Rashi says. Now, speaking of luck, I happened to see a Cheskuni. The Cheskuni, now that we're 4 or 5 days into Bava Kama, we understand the difference between a tam and a muad, right? A muad pays nezek shalom, a tam pays chatzi nezek. So it's a very interesting Cheskuni, the way he explains the concept of chatzi nezek. He says, the pasuk says, "V'chatzu es kaspo," right? It says, "Kigov shor isa shor ehu v'mes u'machur es shor hachay v'chatzu es kaspo v'gam es hames yechatzun," which the Gemara later on Daf Lam in the Lamed alludes to how the calculation is made, but the Torah is already hinting to this concept of chatzi nezek. Says the Chizkuni, Lefi, why does a tam get off the hook? Right? Again, tam did damage to an animal, right? And it caused $1,000 of damage, but the owner only has to pay $500. Why is that? Lefi shahaya tam the ein darko lahazik, because it's not common, right? It's what we call, it's not ein darko. Lohaya labal shelo lehizaherbo. So therefore, because this animal doesn't have a history, as we call it today, right? He has no previous history of being a very, very aggressive animal. So therefore, its owner really had no reason to take special precaution by tying it up. But what happened? Umazla de tarvaihu garum. Okay, here he says it's the opposite. Here it was fate that caused animal A to meet animal B, and the damage was done. Lefichach, therefore, shnehem shavin behezik. Therefore, this is like it takes two to tango. If it weren't for animal B walking along and seeing animal A would never have acted like this. So therefore, it's almost, and there's a lot of deep messages into this, as you can see, I'm not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole, being what's going on in the world. It's almost like if it weren't for animal B, animal A is off the hook because it's not his fault. Okay? He only reacted to animal B. Okay, that's a really deep message. I thought that was very interesting, just speaking of luck. Now, it's interesting that Gillian Hashas, in this Gemara where it talks about Mazel, says, hold on a second. If you look in Rashi on Daf Shabbos, in Shabbos Daf Nun Gimel, there's a discussion over there. I don't want to get into it. We don't have a lot of time, but it's a discussion of on Shabbos whether you're allowed to go outside without an Erev wearing an amulet. So sometimes an animal wore an amulet, sometimes a human wore an amulet, and there's something called a kamiya mumcha and a kamiya that's not a mumcha. A kamiya that has a successful history of actually healing, and then there's a kamiya that was never used before. So the Gemara says, well, if it's a special amulet that's worked before, then maybe you could wear it, but then it brings a contradiction. And the Gemara wants to know, well, is it possible that there's an amulet that works for a man and it doesn't work for an animal? So the Gemara says, yes, in Adam de Islay Muslim Misayale, you could have an amulet or a good luck charm that works for a person, right? It could work, but Behema de Islay Muslim lo Misayale, an animal will never, which again which goes into this discussion we had about whether there's hashkacha klalis or pratis for an animal doesn't have mazel. So if you look in Rashi says on Shabbos Daf Nun Gimel, what's the word Rashi uses? He says malach. He calls a excuse me for 1 second, I just lost my place. He says it's a malach that is guiding us. Okay, that's what the word mazla means. Okay, which is very interesting because in Bava Kama, he says nothing about malach. Here he says malach shalo umelitz alav, right? You heard the expression of melitz yosher. So here, people, human beings, have a malach who is melitz for him. So therefore, we're a little bit better off than animals. Now, elsewhere, where do we have the source for this guardian angel? Because that's what this Gemara is really talking about. He says that people just have, now again, this is a completely different discussion than the one we had in Kiddushin regarding mazel and fate and all that. This is more of a protection, right? But if you look in Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Tes, a very famous Gemara that talks about what happens when you walk home from shul Friday night. It says, Tanya Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Omer, Shnei Malachei Hasharis Malavin Lo La'adam Be'erev Shabbos Mi Beis HaKnesses LeBeiso, Echad Tov Echad Ra. The Gemara says, it doesn't say that on Friday night, 2 new angels come to you. The Gemara, if you read it very closely, it says, the angels that accompany a person wherever they go on Friday night coming home, one says to another, and the Gemara goes on and says, "Hey, if everything looks good, the children are behaving, and the food's on the table, and it's it's a perfect, leave it to Beaver set, then everything is great." And one malach tells the other malach, "Hey, hiratzon shetiel l'Shabbos acheres kach," and if it's a house where everything is topsy turvy like mine. One malach says, "Yehiratzon shetiel l'Shabbos acheres kach," and the malach hatov ona amen. So, putting the Agarata about Shabbos aside, we see very clearly one instance, where we do have malachim that are guiding us, and another instance. I just want to randomly bring a Rambam, a very famous Rambam, the very last Rambam in Hilchos Mezuzah. Says the following. He quotes a Gemara in Menachos that says, "Amru Chachamim Harishonim Kol Mi Sheyesh Lo Tefillin Barosho Uzro V'Tzitzis Bebigdo U'Mezuzah Bepischo." If you're surrounded by mitzvos, you're wearing tefillin, and you have tzitzis, and you have a mezuzah surrounding you, Muchsaku Shelo Yechte, you are virtually guaranteed. This is your insurance policy that you will never sin. Why? Shaharei Yesh Lo Mazkirin Rabim. You have many something that will remind him of all the mitzvahs he's doing. Who are these many people? These are what we call your guardian angels. And he quotes a pasuk, Chonem Malach Hashem, that we say every Shabbos morning, Saviv L'Re'eh Vayachaltzem, right? That the angels of God surround those who fear him, and these angels protect them. So we do see this concept of that there are angels. And how did we get to here? Well, we got to here by this Rashi in Shabbos, which is related to the Rashi in Bava Kama that talked about the distinction between man and animals. So in conclusion, I think we see this concept of mazel obviously used in different contexts. And I think on a deeper note, and I was thinking about this a few days ago, and I can't believe it's such a beautiful connection between Nashim and Nezikin, right? And as we know, there's no coincidence that one Mishnah at the end of one Masechta somehow relates, but the question is, how do they relate? Well, let's think about Nashim. What is Seder Nashim all about? Nashim, I believe, it represents the continuity of Klal Yisrael, right? Who could you marry? When could you marry? How do we propagate, right? All of these laws that we learned in Seder Nashim for the last year and change are all to guarantee our survival, our klali, our plural survival. What is, right? And what fate, as the Mishnah in Kiddushin says, determines for us is obviously closely related to how our family ends up, right? Like the Tiferes Yisrael says, because A married B, 10 generations later, you came along. Everything fell into place. And all of that is what Seder Nashim is about, which is about the continuation of marriage and our continuation of Klal Yisrael. What's Nezikin? Nezikin is our personal protection. Like we just said over here about on Daf Beis, people have a better chance of an attack because whether it's Rashi says we have a mazel, or Rashi in Shabbos says we have these angels, we have our own personal guardian angels, and the biggest question that I want to leave the audience is, we're going to see on Daf Lamed, why are we learning Nezikin? Why is Nezikin such an important thing that we should learn? Because the Gemara says, Haiman de Mahagla by Chasida, if you want to become a chassid, you go over to your rabbi and says, I want to become a chassid. What should I do? So most people say, oh, well, you got to put a hat and a jacket and tzitzis out, and you have to shuckle with a 7.5-minute Shmona Esrei. Does that make you a chassid? So the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make you a chassid. What makes you a chassid, if you want to learn how to become a chassid, he says, learn Bava Kama. Learn Bava Metzia, learn Bava Basra, learn laws that govern how one person interacts with the other person, because that is what's going to teach you how to be a chassid. When we know how to survive amongst other people, which is what Nezikin is all about, it's survival, right? It's perseverance. And how do we keep our shmira, right? How many times in the last few days we had the word shmira, right? The mission said, ushmiratan alecha, you have to watch it. The word shmira means a lot of things. It means spiritual, right? As the pasuk in Kitetza says, v'nishmarta mikol davara, regarding a war, right? And it also means personal. And I think that's a great message and a great flow between Nashim and Nezikin. And that is it.